All right. Well, good morning, friends, and welcome again to Heroes, Scoundrels, and Kings, the characters of the Bible. I'm Dr. Jim Berger, and we are at Chapel by the Sea in Fort Myers Beach. I'm the interim pastor. So welcome as we gather and reflect again on God's word to us. Okay, to all of you online, welcome. It's good to have you with us. There's a few of us here in the room, but we've been getting 120 to 125 views every week. So thank you, all of you who are tuning in. We appreciate those of you who are live with us on Zoom, and those of you who are going to watch this on the recordings. So today we're looking at the period of the conquest. The Exodus has happened. The Israelites are wandering in the wilderness. And now we're going to look at the leadership of Joshua and Caleb as they take over. So the events today are going to come from Joshua, Judges, and 1 Samuel 1 through 7. If you want to check where we are. So the main character this time in this first section is Joshua. He's born a slave in Egypt. He's a son of Nun, and he's from the tribe of Ephraim. And at birth, he's named Hosea. But Moses changes his name to Joshua. The Lord is salvation. And he is the one who will be the leader. He's Moses' right-hand man. He's his assistant. And he rises to command all the Israelite forces. And we're going to see what that encompasses in today's lesson. Now, remember, what we were told last week is they went to the border of Canaan during the Exodus, and 12 spies went into the land and reported they encountered a land flowing with milk and honey. That was the good news. But the bad news was it's populated by giants, and we were like grasshoppers before them. So we can never defeat them. And the 10 of the spies are adamant, we cannot do this. But 2, Joshua and Caleb, say, we can do this. Trust in the Lord, for he will deliver the Canaanites into our hands. But the Israelites refuse to enter. And God condemns them to wander in the wilderness until all of that generation, except for Joshua and Caleb, have perished. And so they live in the wilderness for the next 40 years. Talk about living with the consequences of your choices. And then before he dies, Moses anoints Joshua as his successor. And there's this dramatic scene where Moses summons him and sets him apart and chooses him. And it says, "Be strong and bold. It's the Lord who goes before you. He will be with you. He will not fail you or forsake you. Do not fear or be dismayed." And so Moses departs, dies, as we said last week, on Mount Nebo, looking down on the promised land, but he does not get to enter the promised land. Joshua assumes command, and he prepares the camp to enter Canaan. Now, he's got a big job on his hand. Now, what's been happening over the years they've been in the wilderness is he and Moses have been forming this bunch of slaves into an army. They are an efficient fighting force at this point. So he sends 2 spies into Jericho, and they find shelter in the house of a prostitute named Rahab. And in return for sheltering them, she asks them for clemency. So when they invade the city, she is the only one spared, she and her family. Now, what the spies come back and report is all the inhabitants of the land melt in fear before us. Now, remember that 40 years ago when they went in, they appeared like they were totally intimidated by these guys. Now, these 2 spies come back and say they're scared to death of us because this is not, Jericho is not a military force. It's just a city. And we'll see in a minute, it's a very depraved city too. But here comes this army against them, and they're terrified because they don't have an army to fight back. All they've got is themselves. So Canaan is actually a collection of small city states, and occasionally they would unite against a common invader. And what the Israelites do is they take them one at a time, bump, 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 and knock them off and take control. What happened there? Now, the Canaanite gods demonstrate no moral character at all. So all they ask is, all the people do is obey, make their offerings and sacrifices, and that's it. There's no moral rules for how you should live. The society was brutal and immoral. It was far more extreme. From the archaeological evidence, they can say this was more extreme than anything else in the Middle East. It stood apart. It was marked by child sacrifice to their gods, by sacred prostitution and religious orgies. Their worship was drunken orgies. They brewed a corn beer, and the regular festivals, and as a consequence, the evidence of STIs, sexually transmitted infections, was rampant through the whole city, in the animals and in the people. So that was one of the reasons God gives his order: have nothing to do with them, get rid of them all. And so they have to first get into Canaan. So to do that, they have to cross the Jordan River. And this army comes up to the Jordan, and miraculously, the river stops flowing. And they cross on dry land. They set up a monument in the middle of the riverbed. And then after they've all crossed, the water flows again. Well, actually, that's happened since then. In 1927, it was observed 17 miles upstream from where they crossed the river. The Jordan flows through limestone cliffs, and it's been eating away at those cliffs. And in 1927, they collapsed and dammed the river, and it stopped flowing for 21 and a half hours, just as it had when the Israelites crossed. So the miracle is the timing. The means by which it happened was natural, but it happened when they came to the edge of the Jordan. That's where the miracle is. So after they cross the Jordan River, they renew the covenant of circumcision. They renew the covenant by renewing the ritual circumcision. They have not circumcised their children for 300 years. So in this massive ritual, all the men are circumcised. Of course, then they have to wait a couple of weeks till everybody heals before they begin the invasion. This is also when the manna ceases. This is the last time they will collect manna. That's when they put the jar of manna in the Ark of the Covenant. Now they eat the food of the land, and it's a land flowing with milk and honey. So they're able to live off what they can collect from the land. So during this time, Joshua is getting the people's confidence up, building them up, and he's got them organized now as an efficient army. So they approach the city of Jericho, and contrary to what you would expect, we have an example of the victory coming by God's means and not traditional military means. As Gail was saying beforehand, you hear all these songs about Joshua fit the battle of Jericho, etc. They march around the city once a day for 7 days, blowing their trumpets. And on the seventh day, they march around 7 times. And the whole time, the people are inside at the walls wondering, what in the world's going on? And then Joshua gives the command, they shout, and the walls collapse, and they run in and sack the city and slay the inhabitants. Now, what they're going to do is work their way through the southern portion of Canaan, so what we know is southern portion of modern-day Israel. And they cut off each city and subdue it in turn. There's setbacks, but all in all, they're successful. In the northern section, it's just one battle at Hazor. And after that, the campaign, that was about 7 years. Then each tribe settles into their own territory and is responsible for completing the conquest. So it's not a massive sweep all through at once. Joshua oversees the apportionment of the territory. And so every tribe receives a parcel of land. Judah down here, Asher, Naphtali, Zebulun, Issachar, East Manasseh, West Manasseh, Gad, Benjamin, Reuben, Ephraim, Dan, Judah, and Simeon. All 12 get a piece of the land. Each tribe is responsible for completing the conquest in their area. But what happens is Joshua warns the people that they have to obey God. They cannot back down on this. He says, revere the Lord and serve him in sincerity and faithfulness. And he says, choose this day who you will serve, whether the gods of your ancestors that you served in the region beyond the river, Mesopotamia, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So Joshua dies, and now we've got a period known as the period of the judges. And in lieu of a king, a judge will appear when there is a common threat to people. So each tribe, as we said, is assigned a territory. But if somebody attacks Ephraim, then everybody's going to come together. And when I need help, you'll come to me. And when you need help, I'll come to you. So we have a whole series of judges after the death of Joshua. And most of them we've never even heard of. But at this time, there is no political capital. There's only these little tribal territories. There's no organized national government. And after the conquest, that army is disbanded. So there's no central army. It's just a loose theocracy. The technical term for it is an amphictyony, which you don't need to know, but it's one of those fun things that ministers like to throw around. So the judges arise in the local area. It's rare that the whole nation will be brought together under a judge. Mostly it's regional. And the key comes in verse 20, chapter 21, 25. There was no king in Israel at this time, and all people did what was right in their own eyes. So there's also not a clear system of laws and morality. After the death of Joshua, they don't complete the conquest. They coexist with the Canaanites and intermarry, and they forget about the Lord. So periodically, one of these judges arrives. We've got Joshua. After Joshua, we've got Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, Deborah, a woman in there, Gideon, Abimelech, Tola, Jair, Jephthah, Ibzan, Elon, Abdon, and Samson. You've probably heard about two of them. Most of them, you've heard of Deborah, and you've heard of Gideon. Where do you go? Gideon, and you've heard of Samson, but the rest you haven't heard of. Nonetheless, their stories are there, and you can read them. Deborah is a judge, but she knows they're not going to listen to a woman. And so she tells Barak to lead the army. She'll direct, but he's to lead the army. They won't respect a woman as general, she says. And so under the Canaanites, under General Sisera, are defeated by the Israelites. And although Barak is recognized, Deborah gets the credit for the victory. Gideon routs the Midianite army with just 300 men. And we forget that what he did was staged a nighttime raid that terrified them. They fled into the darkness, and then he rallies the other tribes, and they go after them and defeat the Midianites. He doesn't conquer the Midianites with 300 men. He routs them with 300 men, and then he gets the other tribes to assist, and they go after them and get rid of them. So the pattern is a crisis arrives, an enemy appears, there's a crisis, the people cry out to God, a judge rises up, leads them in conquest, everybody's happy again, they settle down and forget about God again. And then the whole cycle repeats over and over again. Samson is a Nazirite. He's dedicated to God's service, so he doesn't cut his hair and he doesn't drink wine. And he's a powerful man. He single-handedly defeats the Philistines in multiple battles, multiple fights. And one of them, he slays 1,000 people with nothing more than the jawbone of an axe as his only weapon. He's a powerful warrior. And he's so strong, it's said that, because he doesn't cut his hair, that's the source of his strength. But he has a fatal flaw, women. And he falls in love with a Philistine woman named Delilah. And she lulls him to sleep and then has him come in and cut his hair. She's tried a number of times, and he's always tricked her no matter what. He bind me with these kind of with these kinds of ropes, and I can't escape. And she wakes him up and says, the Philistines are here, and he breaks the ropes. And she says, oh, you lied to me. So finally he says, cut my hair, my strength goes. And while he's asleep, she does that. The Philistines capture him and gouge out his eyes, which is a common punishment in those days. You'll find that in several of the stories about when a king is defeated. They get out. Oh, when the last king of Israel in 586, who was that? His name escapes me right now. It wasn't Zedekiah. Might have been Zedekiah. When the Babylonians capture him, they stand him up, bring in each one of his sons, kill all of his sons in front of him, and then gouge out his eyes and take him to Babylon as captive. You know, a brutal world. They take Samson, they chain him in a grist mill, and they use him as a mule. And for years, he's walking in that circle, grinding the grain day in and day out. They've enslaved him. Also, he's got to be pretty strong still to do that, but he's doing the work of a mule. And then one day they're having a giant feast, and so for entertainment, they bring out Samson. They chain him between the pillars of the house, the central pillars. While he has his Pyrrhic victory, he pulls the house down, grabs the two pillars and pulls out the central supports, brings the house down on himself and all the lords of the Philistines, and dies there. Now, as we move out of the period of the judges, we move into the final judge, who is Eli. Eli is the priest at Shiloh, and he's in charge of worship and sacrifice at the tabernacle. You know, they brought it through the wilderness. They've set it up at Shiloh, and the people periodically come there to make sacrifices to God. But he is lax in his duty. He has two sons, two evil sons, Hophni and Phinehas. And they are notorious because they are stealing the sacrifices that people bring. They are desecrating the temple. They are fornicating with the women when they come. And they are an affront to God and to their father. But he can't do anything with them. Judgment is pronounced against Eli and his sons by God. And a woman comes to the temple, Hannah. She's barren. And she prays and says to God, if you will give me a son, I will dedicate him to your service. And so she conceives and bears a son, and that is Samuel. And when he's 7, she brings him to the temple, or brings him to the tabernacle, and Eli takes over and becomes his mentor and raises him to be a prophet, priest, and judge of Israel. So he grows up in the tabernacle, worshiping and serving God. Now, one night as he's sleeping, he hears a voice, somebody calling him, Samuel, Samuel. Remember this story? And he thinks it's Eli. So he runs to Eli and says, here I am. He says, I didn't call you, go back to bed, go back to sleep. It happens 3 times. And he says, it's the Lord. So next time you hear the voice, say, speak, Lord, for your servant listens. And he's told that he will be the new priest. Judgment comes quickly to the priestly family. They are fighting the Philistines, and they decide the way to make sure we win is we'll take the Ark of the Covenant out of the tabernacle and take that with us onto the field of battle. They do that, and they lose. The Philistines capture the Ark. Hophni and Phinehas are killed. And then Eli dies when he gets the news. He falls over, he's so shocked he falls over and breaks his neck and dies. The Ark is held by the Philistines, and then all kinds of curses fall upon them. And finally, there's mice overrunning the town, and finally put the Ark on an ox cart and just let the oxes wander, and they wander back to Israel. So they know that it's the hand of God, and the Ark is brought back to the tabernacle through the miraculous hand of God. Now, with Eli out of the picture, Samuel becomes prophet, priest, and judge for all those different tribal regions. So he makes a circuit through them, and he makes his regular rounds. He's in charge of civil jurisdiction. He's the judge. He's settling all the disputes, all the legal questions, and he's the spiritual leader. Wherever he goes, he leads the people in worship. And he's recognized as the greatest prophet since Mosaic times. So he brings the word of God to the people. And he brings the word of God about what's going to happen next, what God calls him to do. And he prevails on the people to purge Canaanite religion, Canaanite worship from their towns and their homes. And so you have a resurgence of faith in God. Samuel is leading it, and then comes the next chapter. We want a king. No, you don't want a king. Don't you know what a king is going to do? He's going to tax you. He's going to take your sons in his army. He's going to put all kinds of requirements on you. The people say, we don't care. We want a king. And so that leads us up to the next chapter. That leads us up to Saul, or as I call him, the man who would not be king. Saul's the reluctant regent, believe it or not. And so we're going to pick up his story next week. Now for next week, you want to read 1 Samuel 8 to 31. That's going to be the story. You'll find the story of Saul, but it overlaps with the story of David because the two are intertwined. And you'll find some surprising stuff in there. Did you know David marries his daughter? And not only that, he's best friends with his son, Jonathan. We're going to learn a lot of stuff about Saul, his family, and the interaction between him and David. So the next two sessions, Saul and David, are going to overlap because their stories are so entwined. So we're going to, some of the stuff I give you next week, we'll pick up again the following week, but then we'll move on from there. But this will be what is seen as the pinnacle of Hebrew power. So here's what you remember. Number one, the Philistines have power because they know how to smelt iron. Now go back to our first session when I said we read between the lines to figure out when these things took place. So starting around 1200 BC, you find ironwork in the Middle East. So what we know is David's roughly, when you want to date what happens when, David for me is the easy one, my marker, because David is 1000 BC. So whenever I think about something before or after David, before or after 1000 BC, the Exodus, all that's before David, before 1000. Fall of Israel to Babylon, that's all after David. So that's after 1000 BC. So remember, you count backwards on the years too. So we're going to pick up the story of Saul and David. Then the following week, we'll pick up the story of David and his kingdom. All right. And as we continue with Heroes, Scoundrels, and Kings, the characters of the Bible here at Chapel by the Sea Presbyterian Church. I'm Dr. Jim Berger, your host. Thank you for joining me. And we'll see you next week. Please join us again. All right. Thank you and goodbye.